Welcome to My Body, My Bump, My Baby, where we help women be empowered, intentional mothers. This podcast is best enjoyed sipping tea or taking a stroll in nature. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be substituted for professional psychological or medical advice, diagnoses, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, midwife, or other qualified health provider with any questions about your personal situation, health, or medical condition. Welcome back to our podcast. Today we have a very special episode, our very first birth story. And it was really, really important to Hannah and I to do birth stories because I feel like there are really two stories out there. There is the story of I got pregnant, I did everything the doctor told me to do. When labor started, I went to the hospital and I had my baby and I came out. And there's like this big gap in the middle, which is the actual birth, which is the yada, yada, yada part. That's one story. And then the other story is the big, hairy, ugly, scary trauma story where, maybe she goes to the hospital to have her baby and there's a big, long, ugly story about how awful it was and how scary it was and just all of the horrors that you can think of. And we don't hear enough normal birth stories. And so it was important to us to have mamas come in and share their actual experience in birth and share the other stories other than those two that I think are predominantly heard in our culture. So today I'd like to welcome Miss Meg. She is going to tell us a little bit about her birth stories. Meg, can you start off by just telling us a little bit about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Meg Duncan, and I've been coming to Enso for many years, actually, since when I was pregnant with my first, Bryn, and then I've since had another one, Cora, who I'll probably talk about a little bit as well. I'm originally from just outside of Philadelphia in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and, grew up kind of in rural PA as an only child, and I think that the experience of being an only child made me want to run away as far away from what I had grown up with. So I came to Colorado because I wanted to live in the mountains and I wanted to have this amazing experience. And I actually just fell in love with the lifestyle here and met my husband out here. He and I are both from Pennsylvania.
Oh, how funny.
Yeah, we grew up 30 miles apart, but met out here. And don't plan to really go back to Pennsylvania, but absolutely love living here. And I've been here for about 13 years, and he's been here for about 9 years. So
that is awesome.
Yeah.
I love that you guys ended up meeting here, even though you guys were so close together before. It just wasn't the right place or the right time.
Absolutely. We often joke that we crossed paths growing up, and we had things that maybe we did too, we did that were in the same realm, because I played field hockey at the school that he went to for high school or something like that. And we're like, wow, were you ships passing in the night? But yeah, we never met until we met out here.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So we got married in 2017, and then we got pregnant in 2018. And I had Bryn in 2019. So, it was just a kind of learning a little bit about what I wanted for my birth story and what story I really wanted to tell, and for myself, what I wanted to experience, because I don't really know much about my birth story. And so that was something that I wasn't persuaded by one thing or the other of, right or wrong or bad or good or whatever it was. I just wanted to know everything that was out there, and I felt like a sponge, okay, how can I make my pregnancy the best it can be? How can I make the birth the best it can be? How can I make bringing home baby the best it can be?
I love that. So you got pregnant, and when you say your birth story, you mean you coming into this world, your mom giving birth to you, like that did not impress upon you in any way. You didn't really know that story. And so you were kind of on this search for like, hey, what can this be? And so you started, what did you do in your search? Like, where did you head?
Yeah, it was a clean slate for me, right? So I thought, okay, I have a clean slate. Let me create all of these possibilities of education to figure out what I want for my child, which I found out was a girl early on. So I actually started going to Enso for prenatal yoga. That's really where it started. A friend of mine had shared with me that there were classes at Enso that I could go to. I thought, this is great. I can listen to other mamas and hear what they're going to do. And I had just figured it was a bunch of women that were going to sit around just talking about going to their OB and then going to the hospital and having a baby. And I didn't really think that we would like talk because I had been trained in kind of that traditional yoga experience. So going to prenatal was so eye-opening because there were second-time mamas and some third-time whatever. And they all shared these different birth stories or their plans for birth. And I thought, wow, what else is there? And so that was when I found out about classes that I could take. So jokingly, I said to my husband, I want to take every class that Enso has to offer.
I think you did.
But we did. And yeah, we took breastfeeding basics, and the 5-week childbirth class was really the one that solidified the forks in the road that you can take, and understanding that it doesn't have to be this linear choice that somebody else makes for you in birth. You have the ability and the power, no matter where you put yourself for birth, whether it's home, whether it's at a birth center, whether it's at a hospital, that you can make those choices. Because I had just assumed that if you had the baby at the hospital, that all the choices were made for you. Mm-hmm. And I was so enlightened by taking the 5-week childbirth class and having a doula and finding out so quickly that, wow, I can actually say, no, I don't want that. Or I also don't want that for baby. Or I want this for my husband, or whatever it was. And granted, there were a little bit probably more flexibility in 2019 at the beginning at the hospital setting pre-COVID. Yeah. So we had, the unlimited probably guests and visitors or whatever. But as a birth team, I knew I just wanted my husband and our doula. And that was another thing that I had never really known what a doula was. I like, the word is like a buzzword, right? It's like, oh, do you have a doula? Does everybody have a doula? And you're like, what's a doula? Like a couple of years ago, you're like, okay, what's doula? And then you really find out what a doula does and how they help you. And I'm very grateful because I had probably one of the best ones, I think, in the community. Aww. I'm biased towards her, but she'll help you anytime with any questions you have. And that's really somebody that normalizes birth for you, and all your silly questions, they're like, that's not silly.
Yes, exactly. I was just going to say, they're not silly questions, or all the concerns that come up. I mean, they're like real, mama concerns where you're just like, oh my gosh, this thing is happening, or is this normal, or
yeah,
right? Yeah, all the things.
Definitely. Mm-hmm. And the biggest, the weirdest thing I think for me that I wasn't expecting was that I went so late with wanting to have a natural birth, but not really understanding that mamas don't, I didn't really understand that mamas don't all just go into labor on their due date.
So how far over your due date did you go with
Bryn? I was 42 weeks and a day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the patience around that, and the impatience, really, let's be honest, it was more about impatience.
Every day over that due date feels like forever, right?
It does. Yes. It just feels like the day drags on, and you're thinking, is it going to happen now? Is it going to happen now? And I also had prodromal labor, so learning a little bit more about the whole birth experience. I think I kept gearing myself up with the first time around of having prodromal labor and thinking that it was the time. and then it would, go away. And for mamas that maybe haven't heard that before, it's kind of this like false contractions. They'll start, they kind of look real, feel real, I should say, not look, but feel, or maybe on the timeline they look real. And then they'll just fall away after a couple hours.
And it really messes with your head, right?
Yeah.
It just really...
Yes.
What is going on?
Yeah, and you get in there like, today's the day.
So excited.
And then you go to bed and you're like, I didn't have the baby again. I wake up the next morning, I didn't have the baby again.
Aww.
Yeah, so from a perspective of the birth experience, kind of what I was looking for, I knew that I wanted to have a hospital birth because I felt like I was still kind of unsure about what happens if something does happen. Mm-hmm. And I wanted maybe a little bit more of that security, I guess, of being in a hospital.
Yeah.
So that was part of the planning with taking the 5-week childbirth class. We were able to decide, like, hey, this is really what we want, to be able to birth in the hospital. But then the experience that you want, it's so important to be able to communicate that with your OB if you have an OB in a hospital. And that can be really scary for mamas because that almost feels confrontational.
And I feel like sometimes it kind of does turn a little confrontational, and maybe not from the woman who is bringing in her preferences that are not like, your basic order of a birth. I feel like sometimes OBs do get a little bit like, you can't do that.
Yeah.
We don't want to do that.
Yes, absolutely. That was one thing that I could sense from mine that I was kind of testing her limits and her like farthest range of what she felt comfortable with, even going 42 weeks, right?
Oh, yes.
Like that was really like a test of her, of her patience. And the cool thing that the office that I went to, they understood that, okay, you can keep going, but we've reached a limit, and actually my placenta was no longer producing the blood flow that it needed to.
Oh, that's scary.
Yeah. So I went in at 42.
And were you going in for an induction at this point?
I was not. No. I was just going in for the stress test.
Okay.
So I was going in every half week. Like once I hit 40, I think I went in at 40 and a half, 41, 41.
Just to check
just keep
in.
Going. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then at that 42 mark, that was the day that I went in, and the blood wasn't really flowing through the umbilical cord as well as it should have. So she's like, today's the day. And that was when I heard the word induction, and I freaked out because I wanted so badly to have a natural birth in a hospital setting, but I wanted to labor at home. Mm. And that was the story that I really wanted to be able to have. And it actually kind of like looking back on it now, it's so much better that it wasn't that story, because my husband was like, how would I have ever known when we would have needed to get in the car? I was like, because when you get when you start in the hospital, they're like, you're not leaving till you have a baby. If you go that route with being at the end. So what happened with me is I learned about natural induction options.
Oh. And tell us about some of the things that you used with that. Yeah,
so there were some. One of the things that I used was a TENS unit at the beginning. Like at the 41 week mark, which is like that. It's a stimulant. Maybe you can share it a little bit more. I'm familiar with it. I know I used it.
Did you use it for like pain support?
Yeah, a little bit with that, with the prodromal labor, and trying to maybe like support me into, okay, if these really are real contractions, like kind of almost like supplementing or supporting the contractions that were happening to see if maybe they were the real deal.
Nice.
I did acupuncture, and I went to acupuncture to try to stimulate more of the labor, which is a natural route that you can go. But then the one that I did in the hospital when I went in was the Foley Bulb catheter.
I love this option. So I'm going to go a little bit about into that, and then I can go back and talk about a little bit about the other two. that you mentioned really quickly so people don't feel lost. But the Foley Bulb, there's a couple of options for induction, and typically the medical version would be, if a woman is not dilated at all and she still needs to efface, they usually will give her either vaginally or orally or a combination somehow of the two of Cervidil or Cytotec. Either one of those. It sounds like you were already dilated a little bit because it made the Foley Bulb an option. So the Cervidil and the Cytotec, those are both drugs. And typically they are like ground up and they're inserted into the vagina. But the problem with drugs is we never know how a body is going to react to them. Every body reacts differently, just like to any drug, right? Like, I can have a couple Advils and that literally will put me to sleep, and Benadryl does nothing for me, but puts other people to sleep. So we just never know how a body's going to react. So, it's a little bit unpredictable and you have to watch it. The nice thing about the Foley Bulb is it's literally this little device that is inserted into the vagina and then filled up with liquid. And that liquid puts pressure on the cervix, and that pressure allows the cervix to open. The nice thing about it is it's very controlled. It's not a drug. If it's not going well, it can be removed at any time. With drugs, you're kind of committed. Once it's on board until your body gets rid of it, right? So yeah, that's lovely. And I think there's a lot of women have never heard of this option to get a labor started, but it's used very commonly with midwives, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was the funny thing when I went in that night. The OB on call, she said, "Wow, it's crazy. I never used this." And in one night, I had 2 women that requested this Foley Bulb. I thought, I wonder if it's another Enso mama.
Probably was.
Because they learn about it.
They do.
And they know it's an option when they come into the hospital.
So, I'm going to just throw this out there really quick for the listeners. We always talk about, at Enso, we always talk about this secret menu of options that the hospital has. So really what they do is they put out this one-size-fits-all birth. But there's an entire secret menu of options. And if you know what's on the secret menu and you request something off of the secret menu, they're more than happy to oblige. But the key is you must ask, because they're never going to let you know that the menu exists. And so you knew about the secret menu options and were requesting some of these options. And it sounds like another woman might have learned about them too. And so the doctor's like, "Hey, this is interesting. Nobody has ever asked me to do these things."
Yeah, it's quite an experience when you go in and then you start to advocate for yourself. They all this. I think that they are taken aback by maybe taking that route of going, okay, this is somebody that from the beginning maybe understands what they want and where they want to go. And that's a completely different dialogue and conversation, because I'm probably jumping a little bit ahead, but one of the things that I knew, because I was group beta strep positive, which for some mamas, everybody has their own choice around this, but I knew I didn't want antibiotics before I had the baby, as long as my water broke late. So that's like another thing that you learn through the secret menu item is that if your water's intact long enough, baby's actually never really exposed. If water breaks late and then you're dilated enough to push, baby comes out. So in my case, my water broke at 9 centimeters.
Nice.
I was never really exposing Bryn to GBS. I mean, she was through the birth canal, but not in the sense that she was exposed when my water broke in. And I didn't need the antibiotics. And there wasn't the concern around sepsis or the fear. So I know a lot of mamas will hear that, oh, I'm GBS positive, I immediately will get the antibiotics, whether their water has broken or not. And so learning all of these, like having those conversations with your spouse too, like, okay, if I would have been 5 centimeters and my water would have broken, I would have gotten the antibiotics.
And you probably should have.
Yeah, definitely. But then you learn kind of at the hospital, because they still approach you about it. Like, it's 7 centimeters. She was like, are you sure you don't want the antibiotics? I was like, but my water hasn't broken yet. She's like, but are you sure you're 7 centimeters? Like, this is when we give it. And so that's a lot of the times with mamas with the conversation where all of a sudden, like, you're in active labor, 7 centimeters. You're not like in
a good headspace to make these kind of choices.
Exactly.
But lucky for you, you guys had already learned about it and discussed it and already knew where you wanted to head with this before before you even started labor.
Right.
But also you knew before they asked the question. And I think a lot of women come into these situations and they actually don't realize that all of these interventions can happen. And so when somebody comes and says, are you sure you don't want the antibiotics? They're literally hearing it for the first time, and it sounds like, oh my God, I need antibiotics. That's really scary. Of course, give me the antibiotics. But we'll do a little bit of a podcast in the future, a little bit more detail about, being cautious around the antibiotics, but a really quick, brief reason why you might not want to have the antibiotics if your baby is not in danger, and in this case, your baby was not in danger, is because it basically wipes out all of mom's bacterias, and mom is responsible for the initial seeding of baby's microbiome. That beginning of the microbiome is the start of their immune system. There's a ton of science on it. We'll get way deep into it in the future, but when you're trying to do the best thing for your baby, you are kind of like doing this, walking the tightrope, a little bit, where it's like, well, I know because I did some homework and I got educated. I know that my baby is actually not in danger right now, and maybe for me right now, it's more dangerous to give the antibiotics when I have the opportunity to give my baby a fantastic microbiome to start with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something that they would never take the time to explain to you right at the So those
and you're not in a place to hear it either.
No.
You're in labor.
Right.
You're like,
exactly.
What?
Yeah. And I think, we've been skipping back and forth a little bit, but the way that I was, envisioning things was that I would labor at home, and then I would go to the hospital, and I would be at the end, and I would just push baby out. I had never really thought that all the forks in the road would happen starting at the hospital and all of the decisions that would be made. So I think that the one thing that I really can't advocate for enough with mamas is having a doula once you're there. And honestly, to maybe all the mamas listening, this is what I joke about with a lot of my friends. Like, sometimes a doula is just so great for your spouse or your birth partner or your support team, whoever that person might be, your person that's there with you, that the doula can almost sense and empower them to be the best person that they can be in a birth experience. And what I mean by that is that they are actually yes, they're there for mama, and they're rock stars, and they're moving mama around and making sure that labor continues and is moving along, but they're also reading what that birth partner needs to be like, okay, maybe give them the water that they want, that they don't know that they need right now. And they're handing them the water and saying like, give this to the mama, because that's what they need right now. And then they are looking like the hero too.
Yes, I love that. I feel like a lot of birth partners really want to play a very strong role, and they want to show up well, and they want to do really great. But then when it all starts, and a lot of partners have never seen anything like birth before, so when it all starts, there's a little bit of like the deer in the headlights. Oh my gosh, I don't want to hurt her. I don't want to make a mistake. And I'm just going to stand here frozen with this like, look on my face. And so I agree. I think, a doula can read that and pull them out of it and give them a suggestion. And for them, that suggestion is safe because she knows what she's doing and I can't make a mistake. She said to do it. And then I show up in a really great way for the woman in my life.
Yeah,
I love that.
So I'll share a little bit about what I did to prepare, and talk a little bit about the experience in my birth, in my labor. and I'll just kind of talk through the timeline briefly. When I got to the hospital, the Foley Bulb was inserted around like 10, 11 p.m. at night. So I was still kind of running on a little bit of adrenaline. Obviously, getting that inserted, it's not the most comfortable thing. Right. So I walked around and just tried to get myself into a space where maybe I felt a little bit more tired and I could start to go to sleep and wake up and hope that I was starting labor.
Did they give you a sleep aid?
They didn't.
No.
And I probably turned it down. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper.
So you're like, I got the sleep thing.
Yeah. I just had to like whine off the adrenaline, the everything kind of shifted because within that day, I went from going to being like, I'm going to labor at home to then thinking, okay, my placenta's wearing out. I need to go to admit myself into the hospital. I'm going to have this Foley Bulb inserted. And then I'm going to bring home a baby.
That's a lot to digest.
To the hospital, yeah. Yes. So going to the hospital was a means to an end, but it wasn't the way that I had seen it. And so it was reorienting that whole story for myself. And so I slept probably 5-ish hours, maybe like midnight to about 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. And that was when the contractions really started for me, like about 6 a.m. in the morning the next day. And the Foley Bulb fell out for me, for those that kind of, research it after and look at it. The Foley Bulb fell out at about 4 centimeters, I want to say.
Perfect.
And then you just hope that that's what they say to you. They hope that everything starts to kick in. Once it falls out, they hope that everything naturally takes over and
did it for you?
Yeah, and it did. And so I was very lucky that my uterus just started naturally doing the contractions and knew what to do. It was like that little, like I forget what the doula had mentioned it was called. It was just that little like kick that my body needed, right?
Right.
That it wasn't getting from anything else.
Right.
To say like, okay, it's time. Like, let's do this.
Nice.
And so over the course of those hours, that's when everything really started. And the classes that I took and the conversations that I had beforehand, especially some of the books that I read. I can't stress enough how much I loved Ina May's Guide to Childbirth.
I love that book. It's a great book.
It's a great book, and it gives you all of these birth stories about breath work and how mamas handle it. And it gives birth stories, maybe not tools on how to prepare for labor, but seeing and understanding different birth stories to always know that everything is temporary.
Oh, I like that.
And that's the part that I had to sit with, because every time a wave would come or you would envision it, it's like nothing you can ever, for all the first-time mamas listening, it's nothing you can explain, really. The feelings that you get and maybe a contraction and how it feels in one may feel completely different in another, but knowing that those waves of contractions are always temporary, that's what I could really sit with a lot. And I could understand how to breathe through it and how to let go of a contraction before, because I think sometimes it's so easy to anticipate.
Yes.
When you get one, to be in that rest and be like, it's like the next one's coming.
Right.
Like, oh, I know what that feels like.
Which would cause tension and stress on your body and your mind. So it's really hard to like do that balance, right? Whereas I know there's another one coming, but I need to just chill out.
Yeah.
Right? Rest.
Yes. So, and at the beginning, I would say from that 6 a.m. to about 11 a.m. time period, I was chit-chatty. I was like contraction chit-chatty. I was like on the ball. I was walking around. I'd have a contraction. I'd be like, ooh, that kind of took my breath. That one took my breath away a little bit more. But I could still talk. And that was where I knew the energy. It wasn't energy sucking. It was just like a maintenance of energy. Mm-hmm. Okay, like I know I need to eat something, but I'm still able to talk. Okay, I'm a little uncomfortable. Then around 11 a.m., that's when things really started to shift for me. And
so this is like about 13 hours after the Foley Bulb was placed at this point.
Yeah.
And the Foley Bulb had been removed. And your body is just doing it now.
Yeah.
And there is no medication on board at this point.
Right.
Okay.
And I had the IV Heplock in, but I wasn't connected to anything.
So you could move freely.
I could move freely.
Lovely.
And that's one thing to advocate for again. They want to check baby, but you can say, I want to be able to move freely.
Yes.
And then they say, okay, well, we're going to check again. Okay, that's fine. You check me. And then when you're done, undo it. And I want to be able to move again.
Yes.
Because the movement, I believe, in my first labor is what got me all the way through to the end, to be able to have the birth that I really wanted.
Nice.
Because nothing ever stopped. It was just constant, like, okay, where are we going to move to next? And by that 11 a.m. is when I really fell into the birth land.
I love it.
Like I just let go. I surrendered. I really can't tell you a lot of the where and the what and the how. It was just, I know that I was in the tub at one point because I've been told it back. So sometimes with birth stories like that, where you really let yourself just surrender, I think that you're in this you become in this alternate reality.
Which is what our body intended. It's how nature made us, it's a beautiful, safe place for us to be and for us to cope. And when we get in there, and we get in there in a really good way, there's a lot of blank spots.
Yeah.
But that's okay.
Yeah. I remember you sharing that in one of our classes. Like, it'll be, if you really surrender, like, it'll just be this place where you're just lost in it and you don't remember time, space.
Yes.
I remember people because that's who I had there, but I wasn't thinking about anything. And that's what I would want for any mama, is to feel safe. Because I even felt safe even in the hospital, not hooked up and doing whatever I wanted. And so I hopped in their tub. I was lucky enough to get a room with a tub. But, it was like, how far, I remember hearing, like, in the background to my doula, like, how far along is she? Do not have this baby in the tub. Do not have this baby in the tub. Like, that's, like, their biggest thing at the hospital. They're like, do not have the baby in the tub, which you could laugh about later. But really, it's so interesting because I share that because I had my second in a water birth. I had my second in the tub, and it was like, have the baby in the tub, have the baby in the tub. And the first time I was like, do not have this baby in the tub. So it was just so weird to me to like be able to surrender. And I think that time period, probably like that 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., being in the tub and being moved around was when I felt the biggest waves, the biggest contractions of what I needed to work through, and just be given water, be given food, be moved around, and adjust. And my contractions were very, very intense, but they were doable, and I could really surrender in the off waves. I do remember that part of everything, is that I could just relax and be, and that gave me enough energy to make it all the way. Because, I was nearing, at this point, like the 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, when you're after 15 hours. That's a lot on your body.
It is.
And that's sometimes with a lot of my friends, that's like right around that period where you're like, maybe I go down the epidural route and I need a nap because I don't know if I can make it till the end. But that thought never crossed my mind because of all the planning and preparation I had done.
You felt confident that you had it.
I did.
I love that.
And I knew that it was getting so intense to the point where I was like, my husband jokes that he thought I was going to rip the railing off of the bed. And I don't even remember this, but he was like, can she grab the railing? Like, I remember he asked the doula, can she grab the railing of the bed? Because she might rip it off in her contractions. But I don't remember this. And I was completely nonverbal. That was the other part. By this point, the only words that I was using was when I was being asked to be checked. And that's maybe one other piece that I wasn't prepared for in the hospital, is that they're very check happy.
Oh, yes.
And I hadn't been checked. I had only been checked once from where I was at 42 weeks. She checked me, and she was like, you're, 1 centimeter, 75 or 80% effaced. Like, this is where you're at. This is the decision we need to make. So I wasn't familiar with being checked, but being checked in active labor.
So uncomfortable.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So painful. So that definitely threw me off. And that was the only time that I was really verbal, where I was like, if they have to do it, great. But they're so worried about if you start to push before 10 centimeters in the hospital.
Right.
Which is fair.
Right.
So they checked, and that was when I think that all this sort of played out. So I was about 9 centimeters.
So this is beautiful. You go in for this unmedicated induction. You actually didn't have any vaginal exams until like 9 centimeters. Is that right?
I had one other.
Probably right after the Foley Bulb.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep, they wanted to know how far I had gotten.
So for the listeners who have not had a birth in the hospital yet, what is typical is they'll come in and do a vaginal exam every 2 hours. And so menu, secret, menu, option, and probably requested on your birth plan not to have like minimal vaginal exams. And so typically they would do 2. One at the beginning just to make sure you're admittable, which they did, and then one at the end just to make sure you can push, which sounds like they also did, which is really nice because I think it's really hard to stay in labor land and focus and do the work of labor when it's really uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable when they're doing that.
Yeah. I didn't realize how painful, almost painful that would be. And that was at 9, I think they had just checked me just right around then, and then my water broke. Oh, and and all of it kind of played out. They were like, okay, she's at 9, then my water broke, and then within that time period, I can't really tell you what happened. I know transition happened. It
happened quick,
I know
I'm sure.
Started pushing. Yeah, it all started to happen really fast. And then next thing I know, I kind of got that urge to push, but it didn't feel the quote-unquote pushing that we use that word and that terminology didn't feel intuitive for like the way that you want to jive with the baby to really help them with that exit strategy. You're like, okay, is this what it is? And they'd be like, no, it's more like this like deep bearing, like, you know how when you learn those breath techniques and they're really deep and you don't want them to be high pitched, in labor when you're going through those waves. It's kind of the same thing. You don't want your pushes to be like high pitched pushes. Right. You want them to be deep and low and really and down. And I just wasn't grasping that. So I was like I was pushy, but I didn't really know what that meant. So then they were starting to use different words. And I have to share this because it kind of cracks me up. And it's something that I share with my birth story every time. But I started to notice, like, these people kept coming into the room. And I remember afterwards my doula saying, like, I thought it would be okay. I figured you'd feel it was okay. Your husband said it was fine. But I realized it was because there had been so few nurses at the hospital that had seen a natural birth. You were teaching them what an unmedicated birth looked like because they had not seen it. And it was wild. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. I talk about this a lot in our classes, but a lot of the hospital staff does not know what unmedicated labor looks like, which is another unique thing about a doula. A doula knows what unmedicated birth looks like. She also knows what unmedicated birth looks like in the hospital and out of the hospital. They actually look different. You've experienced both, so maybe you have that experience of them being different. But that is super cool. Yeah, and it's neat to. I just remember being like, were there a lot of people in the transition into the end? And she's like, yeah, they were just so fascinated, and they said, hey, like this nurse had never seen an unmedicated birth. Do you mind if she pops in? And my husband was like, sure. Like, I'm sure that they'll just stand off and kind of watch it all. So
that's such a beautiful thing for me. Just like hearing that it's such a beautiful thing. And conversely, it's a little sad, but it's beautiful that she got to learn and see that.
Yeah. Definitely. So I hit just shy of 18 hours. So I had her at 4:23 p.m. And I didn't, in the kind of like traditional sense, I think the things that had happened for me with my first, with Bryn, dictated what I wanted for my second. Like, one thing is that I didn't catch her, right? Like, I didn't experience that. There was a disconnect between like, okay, the head's out, okay, the shoulders are out, and then you get stitched up, and then you birth your placenta, and there's still this kind of like the shock of that, the like everything kind of procedurally happening in the hospital. And never being through it before, so you're like, oh, okay, this is, okay, yeah. I remembering that this would happen. But then what I wasn't prepared for was the birthing of the placenta and how uncomfortable that is.
It was pretty uncomfortable for you. They were they tugging on it?
Just pushing pushing really, really hard. And nobody had ever, like, we talked about it in our classes, but I hadn't, nobody ever talks about birthing the placenta. No. You birth the baby and then you're done.
Right.
But you're like, no, there's this whole other thing that has to happen
right.
before, you're really done.
Right.
And sometimes, and to this day, I actually think with both of my babies, birthing my placenta was more uncomfortable than actually birthing my babies.
I think that might be true for a lot of women. I think that a lot of women don't realize the procedure that goes around it. I mean, it shouldn't really be that painful. It's not hard like a baby's head. It's more like a jellyfish, it's like soft. But there's a whole medical procedure that goes around it that is just very aggressive and painful, I think is probably the part that you're referring to.
Yeah. It was a little different, and we don't have to get, like, I hemorrhaged with my second. So I was definitely in a different space of feeling safe, but differently, because it was my second time around and I felt like I could ask the right questions and I never felt nervous. But with the first time, I think it was just like, I didn't realize how much they pushed down to really birth the placenta. And just then the baby, their feet kind of helping to push too. Aww. Like, I love that. Like, the baby's there and they're like kind of, they're working their way for the first time on you, and their feet are also kind of doing the work on your placenta to push it, which is really neat. But I don't really remember that as much with my first. It's more fresh in my mind now with my second, because I just had her recently. Love that. Yeah. But I quote unquote like finished everything and thought, wow, this was the empowered birth that I wanted. Yes. And I got what I wanted. And I remember thinking, oh, Ring of Fire was going to be the worst thing, like when the baby said that, I'm pushing, and just before you push out the head, and that's the part that's going to be like the hardest. And I remember the doula, she comes in with a hot towel with ginger and she just sticks it right on there. And it was just soothing and calming. And I thought, oh, I can get through this. Okay. And so everything, you kind of like, you're not thinking that actively, like, oh, I can get through this. But there's those synapses that are running through your mind. Okay, this is temporary. This is going to be the next thing. This is going to be the next thing. And then really for me, the wild part is that I never, I birthed Bryn and I never even considered asking for pain medicine.
I love it.
I never even thought about asking for it, because I just felt like I was given so much empowerment to be able to have the support that I needed, and I felt safe.
I love that.
And that's the part that, whether in the hospital or not, feeling safe is the most important when you're feeling nervous.
I agree. I feel like feeling safe and supported and confident is probably the 3 key ingredients in having that unmedicated birth. I feel like if you have those 3, I think you can make it through it.